Morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion titled Standing on the Cusp, Where Will the Next 100 Years Take Us? Our objective during this panel will be to discuss the medical regulatory community's accomplishments over the last century and then to get a sense of where we are headed next. What will be our challenges, our new challenges, and how will medical regulation change and adapt as the Federation of State Medical Boards begins its second century of service? Now, who better to address these questions than experienced medical regulators? We have assembled a distinguished panel of FSMB leaders who many of you know very well. Mr. Lyle Kelsey, Dr. Jan Ryan, and Dr. Barbara Schneidman. Let me introduce each one and then we'll get started. Lyle Kelsey is the Executive Director of the Oklahoma State Board of Medical Licensure and Supervision. He has many years of experience in health care, having served previously as Associate Director of the Oklahoma State Medical Association for 18 years, and he is a former President of Administrators in Medicine, AIM. Mr. Kelsey is a Certified Association Executive and Certified Medical Board Executive who earned his MBA from the University of Central Oklahoma. Dr. Janelle Ryan, you heard this morning, is Chair of the Federation of State Medical Boards Board of Directors. Dr. Ryan is the Medical Director of Cape Fear Health Net, a nonprofit agency that coordinates and delivers care for the poor and uninsured in southeastern North Carolina. She is also a medical consultant for the New Hanover County New Health Department and a clinical associate professor of medicine of the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. She served previously as president of the North Carolina Medical Board. She is board certified both in internal medicine and in infectious diseases. And finally, Dr. Barbara Schneidman is also well known to all of us, is a board certified psychiatrist and a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. She serves as chair of the Federation of State Medical Boards from 1991 to 1992, and probably is the only chair to also serve as an interim CEO and president of the Federation, most recently in 2009. She also was the vice president of medical education at the American Medical Association from 2002 to 2008. Dr. Schneidman has been active with the Washington State Board of Medical Examiners and is currently the chair of the FSMB's Special Committee on Re-Entry to Practice. Now, before we begin our panel discussion and engage all of you in conversations and discussions, I'd like to share a little bit of background about healthcare in the United States, just sort of to set the stage, if you will, and the relationship of healthcare to medical regulation over the last century, beginning in 1912 and then all the way up to today, to help frame the subject. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. There is a separate panel discussion or lecture later this morning about the history of the Federation and State Medical Boards, but I just wanted to set the stage for our panel discussion. So let me begin with my first slide. Let me begin with my first slide. Technology. There we go. So, so this is 1912. What was life like? I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but the Ford Model T had been around, and there were about 200,000 cars in the United States in 1912, believe it or not. Now, how much do you think a car like this would cost back then? Any takers?
$500.
How much?
$500.
$500, actually $80,
Oh,
which was a lot of money back then. And of course, we've come a long way, but you know, it was beginning to become affordable. You didn't have roads everywhere, but this is what life was like 100 years ago when the state boards got together in this merger to become the Federation of State Medical Boards. Of course, there were no voting rights for women in 1912. That came several years later. So there was quite a women's suffrage movement in trying to convince the powers to be in Washington, D.C. to give women a vote, and they deserve a vote, and so there were posters all over. If you were here in 1912, you would see them all over the place trying to convince the American public that women should also have a right to vote. So that's not good. On the other hand, in terms of that it wasn't available in 1912, but then again, there were no income taxes in 1912 either.
Wow.
Wow. That didn't happen until the following year, 1913. Fortunately, the budget of the Federation of State Medical Boards in 1912 was $280. So I think corporate taxes came a little bit later, but this was an interesting time back in 1912. There was innovation, but really the concern was getting the state boards together in the first place and seeing if there's some commonalities that can be achieved while preserving the state's autonomy and their own rights. So what was healthcare like in 1912? Well, the top 3 causes of death are listed for you: pneumonia, tuberculosis, diarrhea. Dr. Ryan is an infectious disease specialist. I mean, these things do occur today, but they're not the top 3 causes of death today. They're the acute causes of illness. Certainly back then, they led to death because, in fact, pneumonia was thought to be a viral condition. The notion that influenza was a bacteria was not well known at that point, and so there were no antibiotics available as such. That's why the pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918 became such a big issue. Tuberculosis, there were challenges in diagnosing and treating as well, and diarrhea was a killer of especially young children and infants because potable water was not something that you could take for granted in much of the U.S., which was very rural at that time. In fact, Dr. Lawrence Henderson, a noted physician from Massachusetts General Hospital at the time, said in 1912, for the first time in human history, a random patient with a random disease consulting a doctor chosen at random stands a better than 50-50 chance of benefiting from the encounter. And while some of that may be related to competency, because at that time we still had a lot of unaccredited medical schools, residency programs were not the 4 that they are today, but this also spoke to the lack of full understanding on the part of the medical profession in terms of how to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. So it was an interesting time to be a state medical board regulator back then. The concern was really to primarily to look out for the so-called quacks and those who were promoting snake oil as the cure-all for cancer and things like that. Now, what have been the major achievements of the Federation over the past century? Well, certainly one of the earliest areas that the Federation and its predecessor organizations dating back to 1890 got involved with was undergraduate medical education. And so we promoted and supported through the state medical boards higher standards for medical school admission and graduation. In fact, in the 1800s, the state boards insisted that to get into medical school, people should at least have a high school diploma, let alone a college diploma, because very few had college diplomas back then. But they said it makes sense to at least have a high school diploma, and we're going to require that before we give a license to practice medicine. Also, graduation standards and later standardization of guidelines for state-based medical licensure and discipline. The advocacy of state laws to bar licensure for graduates of unaccredited medical schools actually began even before the Flexner report, which really led to the wide-scale closure of many of these proprietary, unaccredited type of medical schools. But really, the states played a very critical role. In fact, Dr. Flexner even speaks about how successful his report was, in part because of the role of the state medical boards in making it happen in terms of making the right decisions about closing some of these schools, which was unclear what kind of curricula they had. The creation of the FSMB bulletin, that was our first communication vehicle back in 1913. We now know this to be our Journal of Medical Regulation that many of you are familiar with, but that's been published continuously since 1913, an early effort way before technology to share information among the state boards. Support of the National Medical Board of Medical Examiners, which was founded only 3 years after us, ultimately the ECFMG. We played a role in the establishment of the American Board of Medical Specialties, the Accreditation Council on Continuing Medical Education, the Accreditation Council on Graduate Medical Education, as well as the Council of Medical Specialty Societies. And as you heard Dr. Benjamin speak this morning, we played an instrumental role in the partnership with the NBME to create the Flex exam, but also in 1992, the USMLE examination. Ultimately, again, as Dr. Benjamin mentioned this morning, creation of an all-licensed physician database, a board action data bank, as well as a disciplinary alert service so that if a state board takes an action in one state, that physician can't simply go over and cross state lines and start shop before the other state finds out. That is a very robust system. You all know this. I'm speaking to the choir, but people outside the medical regulatory community don't always recognize the value of something like that. Ultimately, the creation of the FCVS, the Federation's Credentials Verification System, and the Uniform Application, both designed to streamline the process by which physicians get licensed and that state boards can efficiently and quickly make decisions that they need to make about licensure as well. And then finally, more recently, collaboration back in 2004 with the ECFMG, with the USMLE program to create the Step 2 clinical skills examination, and more recently in 2010, the adoption of a framework for maintenance of licensure. So just finishing up, what are the top 3 causes of death now? I don't have data for 2012 yet. The year hasn't ended, but certainly in 2009, the top 3 causes of death were not acute conditions for which we now have treatments available. They were chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases as well. Age-adjusted death rates have improved considerably, a record low in 2009, only 714 per 100,000 in the U.S. Life expectancy also record highs, and it has generally increased even across all ethnic and racial groups over time, although there are still disparities that need to be addressed. And that's a remarkable accomplishment. But as you heard Dr. Benjamin speak, as the Surgeon General, there are still areas of concern that we all need to be concerned about. And her report that she talked about, her National Prevention, Health Promotion, and Public Health Council, which was chaired by Dr. Benjamin, said that these were the challenges facing the nation in the years ahead. Poor diet, generally, physical inactivity, tobacco use, which still persists, and alcohol misuse, among many others, but these are certainly ones that we need to talk about. So that sort of sets the stage, if you will, and you all know a lot of that material, but I wanted to make sure that we started off on the same page. So let me begin our discussion. We'll start with statements by each of our panelists in response to an opening question. We'll then have a discussion for about a half an hour, and then in the final hour, half hour, we will have an opportunity for questions from the audience as well as questions from the internet audience, which is also watching. We'll conclude with a sort of a lightning round of closing comments in response to a closing question. Each panelist will have a minute for that. Sounds like this is a presidential debate or something, but it doesn't have to be that rigid. We can keep it flexible. I think we've all seen a lot of debates recently, so let's keep this friendly, and I'm sure it'll go smoothly. So let's begin with our opening question for each of our panelists. I'm going to start by asking our distinguished panelists a basic question. I just showed all of you some slides about what things were like in 1912 and how far we have come as a nation in promoting the health and well-being of millions of men, women, and children. And our Surgeon General, Dr. Benjamin, did a great job of mentioning some of those advances that have occurred not only in state-based regulation but also in health care. In looking over the past century of activities, specifically of the state medical boards and the Federation, what do you see as the most important achievements in medical regulation over the past century? Let me begin with Lyle, Mr. Kelsey.
You know, I think the issues that I look at from the standpoint of some of the progress is still hanging on to kind of a high quality of integrity and medical education within the medical profession. I think that you just cannot second guess the fact that we need to keep that as a high standard. And I think the Federation, as well as my organization, AIM, have tried very hard to make sure that we've maintained that level. I think the other thing that state medical boards enjoy is the communication that the Federation has through its physician data center and alert system now. We have much better alert systems between the state boards for disciplinary actions, so we know things ahead of time, even licensure and disciplinary. And so I think that's been a great advancement in the past. And probably the third thing is continuing these kinds of conferences where we can all share and network together and share that kind of information.
Thank you, Lyle. Dr. Ryan?
Well, the state medical boards were established early on, and they were actually disbanded during the Jacksonian era. After the Jacksonian era, states realized that really they did need a state board to help regulate medicine. So I actually think establishment of our state boards was a very significant event in medical regulation. Who better than our state members who live in the state, know their medical practice acts, are better qualified to judge and look at the physicians in their state. Often we can help identify problems, we can help people expedite licensing, and so the state boards are very important. I think the second thing that is most important, that's a milestone, is a common licensing examination that sets a national standard for public accountability. I think we have the best and the brightest minds in this country preparing that license examination. So if someone takes the USMLE in Wyoming and passes, we know that they've met the same standard as the physician that takes it in Massachusetts. And I think that common exam is so important, and our state boards have the confidence in the exam. So it's not just the USMLE, it's also the COMLEX USA. But both of our exams are so important. It gives the boards the assurance that our physicians do have the knowledge that they need to possess. It also frees the boards up from doing that work themselves, and it helps the applicants because they do not have a different exam for every state that they have or they wish to apply for a license.
Thank you, Jan. You know, your comment was interesting because I didn't even think that an advancement in medical regulation is actually the adoption and the establishment of the state medical boards. Some of you who may or may not be familiar with history may find it shocking that at one point in this nation, for about 30 years, a decision was consciously made that we don't need any state medical boards. This is in the early 1800s, and nearly every single state medical board was disbanded. This was the Jacksonian era that Dr. Ryan spoke about, when it was basically the power was given to the people to decide. And it was felt that people with university educations didn't need to tell us what to do. And it was an interesting era, but that didn't last very long. And so just before the Civil War is when the need, and as science was advancing, there was a sudden recognition that, you know, we do need state medical boards after all. And then now, of course, in the late 1800s, we had state medical boards established across the country. It's something we shouldn't take for granted, and that is part of our advancement. Thank you for mentioning that. Dr. Schneidman?
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about this question and trying to think of what's a major achievement in patient safety and public protection that we've observed over the last 100 years. I've also had an opportunity to look through the history because I was doing some articles for other organizations looking at the relationship between licensure and certification. And the one thing that really stood out for me was the increase in transparency in medical disciplinary actions, but mostly, I think, the diversity of the actions and the diversity of the medical licensing boards. We look at that beautiful picture over there that was presented this morning, and again, we see the basic white males. We looked at the early boards. This is my 30th FSMB meeting, and I look across the audience. Yes, I was 19 when I first and I looked, but I have an Alabama glass from every single year. And I look across the audience and I see how the diversity of how we've changed. And as a result of that, with more women members, more diversity, more public members, many of whom are women, we've seen an increase in actions and in recognition of sexual boundary violations from physicians against patients. We've had a task force that was established on that. And I think women patients and men patients now feel comfortable coming to their state boards and being able to talk about these issues. We've provided education to medical students, to residents, to practicing physicians on these issues. And I think this openness has really been a dramatic achievement and a real accomplishment in terms of public safety.
Thank you, Barbara. That's an excellent comment as well. Let me begin with the first question for our panel before we turn it over to the audience to have them ask some questions. And this is directed to Dr. Ryan in particular, but either of Dr. Schneidman or Mr. Kelsey can respond as well. Over the last decade, as people have continued to live longer and as obesity has become an issue for us, almost a pandemic really around the world, we now believe there is a shortage of healthcare providers of all sorts, particularly physicians. We know the medical schools, both the MD schools and the DO schools, are doing their part to increase the class sizes and the number of medical schools that they are. The GME issues are still an issue out there in terms of the number of positions have been capped essentially since 1997 under the Balanced Budget Act, but there is a critical need. International medical graduates have certainly helped over the last several decades in meeting that need, but this is a continuing concern, and while you can argue over the numbers, I think there is a considerable consensus that there is a shortage of physicians, physician assistants, and many others. In 2010, many of you know the Federation did something it hadn't done before. It did a comprehensive census of actively licensed physicians. And we were pleasantly surprised by the numbers. We worked closely with our state boards to get the most recent data, and you all know this, we found that there are exactly 850,085 actively licensed physicians as of November 2010 as part of that census of physicians. But we really didn't know, though, so we knew the number, but we didn't know whether they were all practicing, because not every state board asked that question. We didn't know what they were practicing, because they might have trained in family medicine and maybe were now practicing in emergency medicine. Some state boards asked the question, but not all. And so in the past year, we've worked very closely with Ed Salzberg and the National Commission on Healthcare Workforce Analysis to try to get at those numbers by creating sort of a minimal data set. You know, many state boards have contributed to that discussion, and we appreciate that. In fact, it's going to be discussed during this meeting. Why is it so difficult to determine how many practicing physicians there are? Is it as simple as just asking the question, and more, I guess, pointedly, how do you make predictions? Why is it challenging to make a prediction about what's going to happen with our physician workforce? Dr. Ryan?
Well, as Dr. Chowdhury noted, we do have a little over 850,000 physicians, but that are licensed. What we don't know is, are these physicians working part-time? Are they working full-time? Are they working only volunteer in free clinics? Are they retired and just continue to keep their license? And we don't know their distribution. Are they working in an urban setting? Are they working in a rural setting? Do they have multiple practice sites? Do they do one-on-one patient care? Are they more administrative physician? Are they working in the hospital only?
Are they doing telemedicine?
Doing telemedicine. How many states do they have a license in? And we actually have that information. How much time is actually spent on one-on-one patient care versus the amount of time spent in administrative medicine, industry, teaching, research? And finally, do they speak a language other than English? Because in order to address our nation's needs about where we need our doctors, we really need to know this information. Mr. Rick Whitehouse, who is our executive director of the Ohio board, led our work group this year on the minimal data set. And his work group has released a report, which is in your package, trying to look at these questions and posing that the state boards would ask these questions on renewal applications. We want to know those numbers not only for workforce, but it's very important for us in terms of some of our other initiatives, such as reentry and maintenance of licensure, to have that information.
So that's a nice segue. Maybe I'll start with Barbara and then to Lyle. What relevance is this to the state boards? The state boards primarily are focused on licensure, making sure that that's effective, looking at disciplinary practices, making sure that's effective. The actual numbers of physicians almost seems secondary to them. Why should the state boards care about how many physicians there are in their state and what they're practicing?
Yeah, well, the workforce implications, I think, are tremendous. And again, as Jan said, you need to know, are they in an urban setting, a rural setting? There's so many people who have these multiple licenses who really have never practiced in that state. And so you don't really know if these numbers have any meaning. I've been looking at numbers of psychiatrists in different states. Every state has like 1,000 psychiatrists, but probably only 500 practicing. And I mean, when you start to think about the shortage, it has tremendous implications for the care of the patients, and the state boards have to cope with that.
Yeah, I think I came from the Medical Association, as you mentioned, Hank, and the transition from going from the association work to the medical board was tremendous. And I remember all of the AMA meetings, and I knew Dr. Schneidman when she was 19. And the thing that we looked at when I was at the medical was just members. Yeah. That's what you wanted, members. You didn't care if they were part-time, full-time, what specialty they were in, if they spoke a foreign language or not. Now we care. So in 2008, for example, in Oklahoma, one of the things we did, and I know many states do this, but we have 100% membership in the medical board because they have to have a license there. So why not survey that population? So since 2008, we have made it a mandatory survey at the end of renewal, electronic renewal. They can't get out and get a receipt for payment of renewal unless they fill out a survey telling how much time they spend in practice, what kind of specialty, rural or urban, whether they're practicing in a certain telemedicine or not. And we can tell from just those statistics that, for instance, 23% of ours do telemedicine. So the medical boards are a very key element in trying to tabulate that kind of information. And I think it would be a tremendous tool for us to be able to get that kind of information for the manpower needs that are useful in every state.
Lyle, it's a great response. As a current executive director of an important state medical board, I wonder this notion of physician workforce and how much of that is tied to concerns about access to care, not just in rural areas in your state, but I'm wondering with if the Affordable Care Act, Affordable Care Act moves forward with the Supreme Court, they say there'll be millions of people who will become insured and may need to seek care. Is any of this playing into the need to have this data?
I think it is, and part of the reason is that we need to really know how many doctors are actually providing primary care, for example. And so these kinds of information that we can get from the survey will really be helpful to us. And you know, whether it's through the payment mechanism or just manpower needs, I think it's going to be critically important for us.
Dr. Ryan, it sounds like because the state boards are limited in terms of what they can do to change the physician workforce, data is obviously very valuable. Knowledge is power, they say. But it also suggests that there may be a need for some sort of interactions and dialogue and partnerships, perhaps, with the House of Medicine, broadly defined, so that maybe there could be some collective approaches to address this sort of issue.
Absolutely. And that brings in the whole picture of our reentry program. I think that a lot of physicians, or not a lot, but some are looking at reentry. Some have decided they got out of medicine, they missed medicine, their 401k went down, they've decided to go back. And part of the state boards in looking at reentry wants to make sure that that physician is qualified to go back into practice. In some of our reentry programs, we've had physicians that have been out 20 years that have decided to go back.
Sure. Lyle?
You know, it also brings up the issue that medical boards are real good at the far end of it as far as disciplining doctors and in some cases actually taking them out of practice, but we're not very good at the front end and figuring out how to replenish the physicians and to recruit. So one of the things that I think all state boards can do is work with the medical societies and the hospital associations and trying to figure out ways to recruit physicians to your state to kind of offset that balance. And that's a thing that really we have not done in the past.
And Barbara, Jan just talked about physician reentry. Is this an issue that's timely?
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the major points we made in our reentry report was to talk about working with your state medical associations, and if you all come to the panel tomorrow afternoon, you'll hear about this, and working with your academic medical centers who have the potential for providing some reentry services, which, because as we all know, there are so few programs available for physicians who want to reenter.
I recall that discussion. That was actually something novel. Medical schools and academic healthcare centers are very good at the product that they produce, which is physicians with medical degrees, whether MD or DO. Could they play a role in continuing education for physicians once they graduate? And that's some interesting discussions we've had with AAMC, AACOM, in seeing perhaps a shift in their role, in their traditional role. For my next question, this is directed to Dr. Schneidman in particular, and I'll tell you why. Not only is this the 100th anniversary of the Federation, it also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the USMLE program. And Dr. Schneidman, you were president of the Federation when the USMLE was launched 20 years ago. Would you tell us about how that went, and how is it that we, as state boards, have gone from a time about 100 years ago where every state medical board had its own examination, in many cases an essay examination, and if you wanted to cross state lines to another state, you had to take another examination. Sometimes they would have you look at a microscope, sometimes they would have you analyze a case, there'd be oral examinations. It was really very disparate. Every state had its own approach to it. How do you get from that to a common examination like the USMLE examination?
Well, we had a little dress rehearsal for this. For those of you who were at the National Board meeting earlier this year, they had a panel talking about this as well, and Dr. Galusha was on the phone, who many of you remember as the Executive Vice President who was here during this very instrumental time. And it is an interesting history, with each state board having their own exam, and it was resource intensive, expensive to administer, and I think there was actually great relief when the National Board had their certification process and Federation developed Flex. And basically, most state boards eventually bought into that because they realized it made licensure by endorsement much easier. So that wasn't so difficult because the state boards really didn't like the burden of the exam. And then before my tenure began here, we had several different systems. We had Flex, we had National Board Certification, and then for the international medical graduates, some of you will remember the word FEMGEMS. Was it federal? Gosh, I'm trying to remember what it stands for. Foreign medical graduate.
Where's Dr. Casamatas? FEMGEMS?
Manoli, where are you?
Foreign medical graduate examination and medical science.
Medical science, okay. So they took FEMGEMS, ECFMG certification, and Flex. And so there was these very disparate pathways. And the IMGs were complaining that it was a much more difficult pathway for them than for the US and Canadian graduates. And so there was some concern. And actually, this multiple licensing pattern then came under scrutiny in several states in the mid-'80s, specifically California, Florida, and New York. And they were poised to enact legislation requiring a single exam for all applicants. And so it became very clear, we had all talked about a single pathway. This was clearly the time that the profession should do it rather than to have it done to us. So in 1988, a task force was proposed, a single pathway. National Board embraced it, FSMB embraced it, a lot of work went into it, eventually created the USMLE. So then what happened is there was a full court press from the FSMB. They went out to all the state boards and visited with them and talked about this new single pathway and how it would benefit them. And it was done in a very collegial, collaborative way. And my recollection is that it was done very well. We didn't have the internet, but we had, remember the old Federation Bulletin? This was read by every state board member. The only one I had was the one with my picture.
When you were 19?
I was actually 29 then. Okay. This was 10 years ago. And people read it, and it talked about the process. It educated state medical boards. And so by the time USMLE gave its first exam in 1992, it really went very smoothly. So I walked in to a very smooth process that had preceded me by all of this work that had gone on before. It was a very impressive method, I think, that went in, and it's phased in beautifully. And of course, a lot of it had to do with our wonderful collaboration with the National Board.
Thank you, Barbara. And you know, these things didn't happen overnight. I think it also speaks to a level of trust that over the decades has been built up working with the Federation of the State Medical Boards in having the Federation convince the state boards that we're not, as Anish spoke about during his keynote talk, not about top-down approaches, but really collaborating with the state medical boards to come up with solutions to enable the state boards to actually do their job more effectively. And I wonder if, I'm going to put Lyle and Jan on the spot a little bit, if they can, over the last century, can you think of other examples where the state boards played an important role in supporting an important function of the state medical boards that on their own they probably would have found resource intensive, if not resource difficult?
Well, I think one thing that has worked very well is the Federation and the state boards working together with education. And the Federation Foundation put forth a book, Responsible Opioid Prescribing by Scott Fishman. This book, CME credit is given. It educates not only the physicians, the licensees, but also the boards on opioid education. The book has been distributed to over 160,000 people in 23 states, and now we have a second edition that's going to be coming out that is available this meeting. So I think that's a marvelous way that both the state boards and the Federation has worked together to address a common problem, and we're continuing to address that with the second edition.
So assessments, education, Lyle?
Well, of course, I can't speak to the last century. I'm a little younger than that, but I can talk about the last 20 to 30 years.
How about when you were 19?
19, we'll start there. I think the collaboration between really the state boards and the Federation has just gotten better over the years. I think the roundtable discussions that we have on phone conferences share a lot of information. Obviously, not to be redundant, but these kinds of conferences, the Federation works with AIM and many institutes and educational processes. So I think it is really getting much better. The working relationship has really improved the amount of education to help us do better in our daily work.
Thank you, Lyle. Barbara?
You might want to mention the work we do with IAMRA.
I was just going to
International.
do that, actually. Barbara's actually, do you want to talk about it?
No, you go ahead.
So in addition to helping the state medical boards, more than a decade ago, the Federation made an intentional decision and actually changed its mission statement to be not only there to support our state medical boards in the United States and its territories, but to also offer our expertise as necessary to the international medical regulatory community. And so several nations got together more than a decade ago to create what ultimately became the International Association of Medical Regulatory Authorities. In fact, somewhere in the audience is Dr. Florence Lefebvre, the chair of IAMRA. There she is. In addition to being my counterpart at FEMRAC, she's the chair of IAMRA. In fact, we're going to have an annual meeting this October in Ottawa, Canada. Every 2 years we have that meeting. And just like Lyle talked about the value of this meeting, that's an opportunity to share best practices with our colleagues from all over the world. And it's an organization that continues to grow. Florence, how many countries are part of IAMRA now? Roughly? Sorry to put you on the spot. 40 or 50. And that's a significant growth from years ago. And trust me, they don't just become part of IAMRA just for the meetings, for their international travel. There is quite a lot that goes on that is similar. So now it's not identical, but there are, for instance, in the United States, we talk about maintenance of licensure. In much of Europe, that's known as revalidation. And so there are different terminologies, but they're thinking along the same lines. And Barbara, since you asked about it, I'm going to ask you, how has that been of value to the state medical boards and to what is ultimately protecting the public in the U.S.?
Well, as we all know, everybody travels more now. And certainly, I hate to use the case of Michael Swango, but here was somebody who, a physician who was licensed in several states and did go overseas and caused as much difficulty elsewhere as he had here in terms of poisoning patients and fellow physicians. And we were able to eventually track him down. And so I think with an international database and working together, it gives us much more, again, international protection and public safety and patient protection.
It's a flatter world, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And there's greater mobility than ever before. And now, even with telemedicine, one wonders about international telemedicine and how that may lead to great advances. But as Mr. Chopra spoke about this morning, you have to do it in a careful fashion with caveats and make sure that ultimately patients are protected. I'd like to thank the panelists for this engaging discussion. I'd like to now turn it to the audience to open it up to them, to encourage them to come to the microphones. We have, I think, 4 microphones. And if you would please come up and ask any questions of our panelists, we can engage in a conversation about any issues that we haven't had a chance to discuss. So I see someone already in microphone number 2, and I see someone in microphone 3 as well. So we'll start with you. Please identify yourself, which board you're from or which organization, and then if you have a question generally for the audience or someone in specifically, please let us know.
Dal Madia from State Medical Board of Ohio. When I came several years ago, there was individual exam, then came the flex, which I took, now USMLE. It became easier to get any license in any other state. What about portability of license? Because it takes 3 months, sometimes 6 months to get license in different state. And when doctor wants to move from one place to other place, it's really a headache. Do you think portability is a issue Federation should handle?
That's a great question, and you didn't ask anyone in particular, but I'm going to ask Dr. Ryan, as chair of the Federation, to comment on some of the activities that the Federation has been working on with the state boards, and if Barbara and Lyle want to comment, that's fine too. I can tell you that license portability is a big issue. When we did our census just 2 years ago, we were quite surprised pleasantly to learn that almost a quarter of physicians have more than one license to practice medicine, and if they're engaged in telemedicine or teleradiology, there are physicians with 30 or 40 licenses. And so this notion of license portability and having multiple licenses, it's not all telemedicine. What can the Federation do, and what has the Federation been doing, Dr.
Well,
Ryan?
license portability is a huge issue for the Federation. We recognize that, and the message has come across loud and clear to us that we have to get better, we have to be smarter, and we have to accomplish licensing more quickly than we do currently. So the Federation has actually applied and has been granted 2 license portability grants. With those license portability grants, we developed something called uniform application. Uniform application is the same basic demographic questions that you would answer for every state that you would go. But if you go ahead and complete the uniform application, then once it's completed, that speeds your license process. Right now we have almost every state board is looking at uniform application if they have not adopted it already. We actually are going to have a session about that this meeting. Mr. Randall Manning from Maine and the Maine board has submitted a resolution on something they call the Platinum Standard, which is their answer to this question, and we'll be discussing that at this meeting. Our Federation's Credential Verification Service, which was started, does do verification of credentials. It takes longer to get your initial credentials verified, particularly if you're from an international school, just because it takes longer to reach those countries and get those certificates. However, once you have your FCVS certificate, it's much easier to go ahead and get that information for that second license. So the Federation hears that message loud and clear. We realize that's also a big issue with telemedicine, and we've put that as one of our priorities to work on.
And let me ask a related question, because I see from outside the state medical regulatory community this issue of speed coming up a lot. Well, why don't they do it faster? Why can't they create an app and do it in 24 hours? But it's not just speed, is it? I mean, this is a very important decision when a state medical board decides to give a license. They need time to study the material and make sure it's accurate and make a careful decision, no?
Well, we have to ensure patient safety. We have to have high standards. We just cannot give a prescription pad and a scalpel to everyone who applies for a license without credentialing them, checking their credentials very carefully. So we have to do our due diligence and make sure that we maintain high standards. We can't do simply what's easiest for the physician, but not in the best interest of the patient. So that's where the time is.
I mean, it is slow to make changes at medical boards, and we all have, as Mr. Chopra said this morning, which just really got me kind of reinvigorated in this whole process, and that is that we have got to not be afraid to go to our legislatures and open our acts and make changes that would speed up the process. It's just, it's something we have to do. We can still preserve protection, we can still preserve the quality of education, but some of the paperwork and processes that we go through has to be sped up. And I know AIM, we've talked about it over and over and over again, to the point where we've got to make some changes in that process. There's no reason it should take that long.
And I would think that working in collaboration would be the better way.
Absolutely.
Although certainly every one of the state boards could come up with their own mechanism to speed up their own processes, but chances are that they would do similar best practices.
Absolutely. Utilizing the Federation through the license portability and the uniform application, those kinds of things all can work in concert to really speed up the process. And not just for telemedicine, but just for portability between states. If a doctor wants to have a license in contiguous states, it ought to be sped up, and we have the tools to do it.
Barbara, anything to add?
The only thing I would add is that we've been talking about portability and uniform application for a long, long time. But it is now happening. The uniform application and FCVS can talk to each other. We can talk to the boards. And there's been tremendous advances in the speed and efficiency that technology has given us. And so that residents can get into practice faster after they get their licenses. And there's going to be better access to care for patients. I mean, this is now all happening. But it does take a while, and states still have to be vigilant when they look at their applications.
And I guess one other comment I'll make before I turn it to the next question is you saw this morning a large variety of leaders across the House of Medicine, and that isn't just for show. We actually are having and engaging in substantive conversations with many of those organizations, and that actually helps state medical boards in ways that may not be apparent. For instance, when it comes to licensure, and you all know this, when you license somebody, when someone presents their credentials or says, I graduated from so-and-so medical school, whether in the US or Canada or Australia or where have you, that needs to be verified. Did they actually get a diploma? Is there a transcript of their scores or their record? Did they take the necessary assessment examination? What were their scores on those examinations? Did they do postgraduate training? How many years? Where did they train? Was that training facility accredited and so forth? These are important questions, and we've always sort of done that in sort of, once we get the application, we verify. One of the things that the Federation is doing, and Dr. Ryan is fully aware of this, as are many of our board members on the Federation, including some of our state board members, we're starting to have some conversations with the medical schools and the residency programs ahead of time. So that you already know who's in your medical school, you know that that person is going to graduate at some point. Let's set up a mechanism where we can share their information about graduation before they actually apply for medical school, so that when they do apply, we already know that it's verified. Same thing with residency. 98% of residents, when they start year one, will end up finishing their program, whether it's year 3 or 4 or 5, depending upon the specialty. Why not have that information, share that information early on, and the Federation can play a big role in supporting the infrastructure for that, so that by the time they apply to verify that residency, we have that information. We don't have to ask. It's already through the wonders of technology that Anish Chopra spoke about, that's shared. And that's the next paradigm, is to be proactive about these things. And I think that'll help speed things up even more. But at the end of the day, it has to be a decision that the state board feels comfortable in making, and it shouldn't be rushed. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would. And there has to be a process for the physicians that's transferring into the state to make sure that they get the licensure process done first before they make a contract with a hospital. I can't tell you how many times hospitals have called and licensure was a secondary thought. Now they've signed a contract, they've moved to Oklahoma, they bought a house, and they're having trouble getting their license. And they've already made a financial commitment. And so licensure, that's why we're working with the Hospital Association to make sure that we try to do that ahead of time and make sure that we can speed up that process so that those things don't happen.
Lyle, I see a lot of nodding of heads.
Yeah.
And we all have to deal with the phone calls we get when they can't get their license in 3 days,
Yep.
when they've just gotten a job. And it's also communicating realistic expectations as well. Question in the back?
Yes. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Sounds like Steve Sealing.
Yes. A cautionary comment about speed. Sometimes the person who wants his or her license the quickest is running from something. Okay. But Steve Sealing with ECFMG, a comment about the past and a question about the future. With respect to the past, I think in terms of kudos to the Federation, Blind Eye could not happen now. And the reason it could not happen,
Blind Eye, the story of Michael Swango.
even internally, is because of the systems and the technology that you have in place for almost real-time notification. And that is an extraordinary advance. So kudos to the Federation for that.
Thank you.
The question about the future in terms of this world becoming more flat, in terms of a movement for the accreditation of international undergraduate medical schools and the accreditation movement for international graduate education, can any of you see your boards in the future adopting the Canadian approach and on a case-by-case basis accepting international residency to satisfy your GME requirement in lieu of residency in the U.S. or Canada? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Can you repeat the question?
Could you repeat the question, Steve?
Yeah. Basically, our Canadian friends have begun to adopt on a case-by-case basis international residency training for purposes of satisfying their GME requirement. By and large, that is not done in this country with our boards. Given the international movement for accreditation both at the undergraduate and GME level, can you contemplate our boards moving forward accepting or recognizing international training to satisfy their GME requirement?
So that's a great question. Right now, the majority of the state boards, if not all of them, have some requirements for postgraduate training in the United States, whether it's ACGME, accredited residencies, or American Osteopathic Association, Bureau of Osteopathic Specialists, accredited residency training. What Dr. Sealing, Mr. Sealing is referring to is, what about residencies outside that system? Do state boards get those types of requests, and how do you deal with that?
We do. I'd go ahead and answer. We have extended, obviously, Canadian for a long time, but we just recently, within the last few years, extended to the English system, England, Ireland, Scotland, those. But I think it's, again, not being aware of the process for residency training in other countries is a big, same way with medical schools. It's a big unknown. And so I think boards are less willing to accept that without knowing the accreditation process in those particular countries.
Why would you, in those circumstances, I'm putting you on the spot, would you require those physicians to still take, let's say, the USMLE exam?
Yes. Yeah.
Barbara?
I would see, there's 8,000 residency programs in this country. Internationally, how many thousands there could be. And I could see this as such a resource-intensive, expensive process. And then if you do one, you've set a precedent, and then it's difficult to not do them all. So, I just don't see it as very realistic unless we're in a different kind of healthcare setting. The board process changes.
And I know that ACGME is starting ACGME International, or has been in place, but that's going to take a while before it really takes off. A few countries they're working with to explore that, but right now those are not deemed to be the equivalent of ACGME accreditation in the United States. But that's one example of how this trend is starting to occur, but it's something that I don't think we have enough information about how prevalent of a concern it is on the part of state medical boards, but it's something that, Dr. Ryan, as a federation, what role can we play?
Well, I don't know that we haven't discussed this in detail, so I don't have an answer for you, but as Dr. Chowdhury just talked about, ACGME is accrediting some programs internationally, and I know in my home state of North Carolina, Duke has an affiliation with the program in Singapore. And so I suspect we're going to see more of this. And as you all know, the ACGME slots are not increasing to any appreciable degree, whereas our number of medical student candidates are increasing. And so there's been great concern about, will we have enough residencies here in the United States? So I think that is something that we will have to look at in the future.
And my understanding about ACGMEI is that this is to keep the physicians within that country because of...
Oh, okay, so it's not necessarily for them to come to the U.S.
That's right. They really want to have a similar accreditation and board certification process within that country and keep the physicians at home, and that this should not count in any way towards licensure in the United States.
Do you think it's only a matter of time before they...
Oh, they'll push it.
They request that? Before we turn to further questions from the audience, I know there are a few other hands. I'm wondering if we have any questions from the internet audience, and it looks like we might, so hang on. This just in. Thank you.
Just in.
So this question doesn't say it's from whom. We should try to ask to see who's sending these questions. It's not addressed to anyone in particular anyway. But the internet question is, all of you are obviously, it says, very passionate about medical regulation, but it can be a very challenging, sometimes heart-wrenching profession, especially in cases of discipline. What has motivated you to be so involved with the profession when the going has gotten tough? Interesting. Who'd like to tackle that?
I think they'd almost have to come from a physician standpoint. I mean,
Well, I think we're all, as a physician, we're all concerned with patient safety. I have family members that go see physicians. I want to make sure my family sees physicians that are well-trained and practice safe medicine. So I think partially it's a selfish concern on my part, but I think also we feel that we want our citizens taken care of.
I think the question speaks to challenges both in medical regulation and in the profession of medicine, so we can speak to either.
I think as I think about this, there's two things that come to mind. First of all, it was my opportunity to give back to the profession. Medicine has given me a wonderful career, and I felt very strongly that I wanted to do something to give back. And as you know, we're all volunteers when we're in this business, and it's very time-consuming, but it's a wonderful way to give back. And secondly, as a psychiatrist, I had very deep concern for the health of my fellow physicians. And I knew that the licensure system was very involved with physician impairment and discipline, and it gave me that opportunity to work in that area as well.
Thank you, Barbara. And Lyle, what prompted you to get involved with your state board?
well, I mean, I think the interest is from the standpoint, we all say it, protection of the public, but I think the standpoint is to see that we can regulate good practice of medicine. I thought it was interesting that on the previous question by Steve is that we have good communication, even better now with the Federation between state lines in the United States, and we're concerned about somebody running from something and licensure within the United States, and all got an applause for that, and yet at the same time we want to open up for residency for foreign countries of which we know little about. And so I think, you know, we have to balance that in some way. And so there's a great interest in making sure that we do know the information by speeding up the process.
Thank you, Lyle. Question, microphone number one.
Oh, okay. Roger Brumback from the Nebraska Board of Medicine and Surgery. I wanted to follow up on the previous discussion related to recognition of outside the United States or Canada medical schools or residencies. I understand a few years ago, I think it was Arkansas, had a list of schools, many of them Caribbean schools, that they wouldn't ever allow individuals to become licensed in because they felt those schools were not appropriate. And I don't know whether anybody that has continued or what follow-up that is, but it seemed to me that that might be an appropriate thing to look at. Are there, I mean, in the U.S., there were fly-by-night medical schools in the 1800s, which led to the Federation ultimately becoming to fruition. Is there some way we should maybe decide, are there schools that we shouldn't be allowing people to graduate from and come to the United States, even if they could pass a licensing examination?
So that's a great question. Steve Sealing was talking about graduate medical education, but even in undergraduate medical education, one of the challenges is that there is no formalized, accepted, universal system of international accreditation of undergraduate medical schools. In fact, that's why the ECFMG 2 years ago, as a matter of fact, at the IAMRA meeting in Philadelphia, announced that they are going to work with many of their colleagues across the world to implement and work with them to encourage the implementation of standards that would be similar to U.S. standards, which could be of great value to state medical boards. But that's going to be at least more than 10 years away, but although the process has begun. Some of the state boards, I know California has a list of medical schools that it would qualify for those who are applying for licensure. It doesn't do inspections, but it does do site visits, for example. Any thoughts on international undergraduate medical education accreditation and how that relates to state boards?
It is just a constant problem, and that we all fight, and I think it's getting better. I mean, I think we do look from Oklahoma's standpoint, and many states will look at New York and Florida and California and look at their list. We'll look at FAMR and WHO and the Federation information that they may have, but it's just a tough call. And once you allow a license to a particular foreign medical school, it's tough to deny the next one. And so it just sets up a real hard issue for medical boards. We have very little information.
And I know that we have a number of countries over the last several decades have been sending large numbers of physicians to the United States. So I would imagine there's a comfort level with perhaps certain countries and certain medical schools. Yeah. The top 3 or 4 countries are typically India, Pakistan, Philippines, etc. But this is going beyond that, because we now have, even in places like India or even in the Caribbean, we have new schools opening up, and they've not yet been tested. So I think there's some concerns along that area as well, correct? Yeah. Barbara?
I have a vague recollection, and maybe somebody can help me, that the Federation did have a committee that was looking at this, and I think they finally decided that it was just too complicated, and it had too many problems associated with trying to name schools and do something.
We did. In fact, I know this because in putting together the History Centennial book for the Federation, within the last 10 years, and I forget who was chair at the time, it could have been Doris Brooker, but there was a committee created to look into this issue of undergraduate medical education. One of the things that that committee recognized was that the state of U.S. undergraduate medical education was very robust and very sound, which was, it sounds redundant and obvious, but you want to make sure that things were looked at. But I think you're correct. In the area of international undergraduate medical school accreditation, it was very complicated. And where would you begin? We certainly would not, I would think, Dr. Ryan, have an interest in becoming an international accreditor. That's not our mission. That's not what we do. And yet we have a need to support our state medical boards in helping them identify which schools would be quote-unquote legitimate in providing quality education and those that are not. But I think the ECFMG effort is one important effort. I know we have also a talk during this meeting of the National Commission on Foreign Medical Education Accreditation. Nick Femia, Dr. Marty Crane, who's the former chair of the Federation, is chair of that committee. He may have some thoughts as well that he can share on that. But it's an issue that there is no easy answer for, but there are a number of organizations looking at it. Question in the back? Sir?
Could we interrupt for a second here? The president of the chair of the committee wants to say something.
Oh, excellent. The chair of that committee, Dr. Brooker.
Right. Barbara, you're right here. In 2005, we convened that committee. It was very clear that our robust system is due in great part, to the National Board and the examination system that was set up with them, and now, hopefully sometime, Hank, in the more informal systems, the National Board people will talk about the new Foundations of Medicine examination, which is a remarkable circumstance. And that is one of the conclusions we came to, that we need the robust examination system of medical schools in addition to graduate medical education. And clearly also second thing came out, that New York and California and Florida are the only lists really any of us have, and it's inadequate. I mean, they are adequate, I shouldn't say that, but it is not something that is based on robust international medical student examination as we have with the U.S. MLE. And really kudos to the ECFMG as well as the National Board in starting this international effort. Eventually, we'll get there, but in Minnesota, we don't trust necessarily here. We make sense in terms of people's training, but I agree with Lyle. International medical education is very hard to assess without that standard exam.
Thank you, Doris. I want to be mindful of time. We'll take one more question, and then we need to finish up with some closing comments from each of the panelists. Sir.
I think he was ahead of me.
Okay, very good.
Only been here 10 minutes now.
Sorry, I'm sorry. The lights, we can't really see everybody, but I apologize. Go ahead.
I'm Richard Burney, the chair of the board in Michigan. In relation to the graduate medical education question, we've talked about the importance of having some graduate medical education and testing. As far as I know, there's a lot of variability around the country in terms of how much graduate medical education is required for licensure. Has the board given any thought to raising the standard for safety purposes to say you need to complete an accredited residency before you can be fully licensed.
Dr. Well,
Well, yeah, let me just speak to that because I looked at that and I was amazed at looking through the statistical book, the AMA book that comes out and information there of how many states, a good number, I think there was 47 state boards that require 1 year of postgraduate education for licensure. Now, when's the last time you've issued a license to a person with 1 year? We did it probably 15 years ago. 1 year of psychiatric, and the guy went out to be a family physician, and he has a revoked license today. The experience with that just tells us that that's old thinking. Yes, we have to, but I'll tell you, it's not going to be easy with the medical societies. A lot of them really push back against that, but it needs to be a reasonable amount of postgraduate education and completed and progressive postgraduate education.
and in the interest of time, I'll add that certainly from the Federation's point of view, we would seek some commonality and seek whatever you decide that it be something similar so it does make some sense across state boundaries.
Yep.
I'd like to now conclude. I'd like to thank our audience who asked their questions. I'd like to now conclude the panel with what we call our lightning round, one final question for each of you. For our closing question, I'm going to ask our panelists to think ahead to 100 years from now, to the year 2112. Now, nobody knows for sure what the next century holds, and I don't think any of us will be around then. But let me share a few predictions from various amateur futurists that I read about on the internet. One prediction is that the world's population will be 14 billion with a B, which actually sounds very plausible. I mean, just fathom access to care issues on this flat world. Another prediction calls for a single worldwide currency, perhaps. I'm not too sure about that one given what's going on with the euro, but I do think that coins will become obsolete. One futurist predicted that the letters C, X, and Q will have disappeared from the English language because they just aren't needed. I'm not sure. Another predicts that marriage will be replaced by an annual contract. That sounds very cynical. And finally, there is a prediction that computers will rule the world and that humans will end up as domestic pets. So my question to each of you is, assuming we don't all become domestic pets of computers, where do you see the Federation and state medical boards 100 years from now? Who wants to start? 1 minute each.
Wow.
Well, I'll start. You know, we're seeing a boom in the pet resort industry, and my dog's at a pet resort right this week, so that may not be such a bad
I've seen
life.
pictures. It's a nice resort.
Right. But I actually think that we're going to see these issues of state-based licensure portability resolved. I think we're going to see telemedicine resolved. And I think actually telemedicine may not just be from here to Wyoming or whatever, but we're talking international and even to other planets by that time. So I think there are far more implications for telemedicine. I hope everyone will have a medical home at that point.
Whether it's on the moon or Mars.
That's right.
Barbara?
Well, if I'm a domestic pet, I want to be a dog in France because they really know how to treat people. But I actually foresee perhaps some sort of, I hate to say the word national licensure, some sort of nationalization with state-based still having the responsibility for discipline, regional kind of actions, and working together in either regional or territorial things. I understand Australia has done this. Their states and territories now have a national consul, and their territories and states do more regional-based stuff, and I can see them working with the reentry programs, the physician wellness programs, and impairment disciplinary issues.
You know, I think telemedicine is going to be a major issue. I was encouraged yesterday at the AIM meeting that we had Dr. Bernard Harris there speaking to AIM, and what we thought was going to be a very adversarial a speech, and yet he really extended the arm. And I know the Federation last year, almost exactly a year ago, had a conference on telemedicine in Washington, D.C. I think we're going to have to continue. I think we're going to have to change our mental thought process in medical boards and state regulation about telemedicine. And I think we're going to see a tremendous expanse in that over the next 100 years, 10 years to be sure.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Please congratulate them. And